The steel floor beneath her knees had gone numb hours ago. Catalina didn't know how long she'd been kneeling in this position, arms bound behind her back with industrial cable that cut into her wrists with every shallow breath. The air in the lower cargo hold tasted of rust and something else, something organic and wrong that made her throat constrict with each inhalation. Around her, 17 other citizens of Hive Primus knelt in a perfect circle, their faces painted with the same mixture of confusion, terror, and dawning comprehension that must have shown on her own. She'd been a manufacturing worker, nothing more. Her days consisted of assembling charge packs for laser guns on Assembly Line 7, Sector 9, Sub-Level 43. She paid her tithe. She offered her prayers to the Emperor at the shift chapel. She kept her head down and her hands busy, just as the Munitorum instructors had taught her since childhood. But none of that mattered now. None of it had ever mattered. The cultists moved between them with practiced efficiency, their robes stained with substances that caught the flickering light in ways that defied explanation. One of them stopped before Catalina, tilting his head with an expression of what might have been pity or perhaps contempt. His eyes held a vacancy that terrified her more than any rage could have. He reached out with fingers that seemed too long, too jointed, and traced a symbol on her forehead with something cold and viscous. The touch sent spiders of ice crawling down her spine. The chanting had started perhaps 30 minutes earlier, though time had become difficult to measure in this place. Low voices speaking words that hurt to hear, syllables that seemed to scrape against the inside of her skull like broken glass. She wanted to scream, to beg, to promise anything if they would just stop, but her voice had abandoned her. Her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth, as if the very air had stolen her capacity for speech. The cargo hold had been transformed into something that bore no resemblance to its original purpose. The walls were covered in symbols painted in what could only be blood, arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. 8 pillars of stacked skulls surrounded the circle, each topped with a brazier that burned with flames the colour of infected wounds. The smoke rising from these fires carried the stench of burning meat, and something sweeter, almost intoxicating, that made Catalina's head swim with unwanted euphoria. One of the other captives began to sob, a young man perhaps 20 years old who had worked in the same manufactorum. Catalina remembered seeing him at the shift change, remembered his easy smile and the way he would share his ration bar with anyone who needed it. Now his face was streaked with tears and mucus, his body shaking so violently that the chains binding him rattled against the floor. A cultist approached him with slow, deliberate steps. The cultist's movements possessed an unnatural fluidity, as if gravity affected him differently than it should. He knelt before the sobbing man and placed both hands on either side of his face with terrible gentleness. The young worker's sobs cut off instantly, replaced by a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something far worse. When the cultist removed his hands and stepped away, the young man's expression had changed completely. His eyes now held the same terrible vacancy as the cultist's, and his lips had curled into a smile that belonged on no human face. Catalina understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins, that death would have been a mercy. Whatever awaited them was far worse than simple execution. The cultists weren't preparing to kill them. They were preparing to offer them to something, to change them into something else entirely. The leader of the cultists emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hold. He was massive, easily 2 meters tall, his body wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of darkness itself. His face was concealed behind a mask crafted from what appeared to be brass and bone, etched with more of those reality-bending symbols. In his hands he carried a book bound in leather that no animal could have provided, its pages yellowed and crackling with age. He began to read. The words that came from behind the mask were not High Gothic or Low Gothic, or any language Catalina had ever heard, yet somehow she understood them on a level deeper than conscious thought. They spoke of ancient powers that dwelt in places beyond the material universe, entities of such vast and terrible consciousness that human minds could only perceive them as gods. They spoke of bargains and transformations, of flesh reshaped by will alone, of souls burning with purpose eternal. The temperature in the hold began to rise. Sweat broke out across Catalina's body, soaking through her manufactorum jumpsuit. The metal beneath her knees grew hot enough to burn, but she found she couldn't move away from it. Some invisible force held her in place as surely as any chains. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost liquid. Catalina could see it now, could see the way it moved in currents and eddies that had nothing to do with ventilation or atmospheric pressure. Colours that had no names bled through the edges of her vision, and sounds that came from inside her own skull echoed with the chanting of the cultists. One by one, the other captives began to change. It started with the woman to Catalina's left, a middle-aged quality inspector named Helena, who had 3 children waiting for her in the upper hab blocks. Her scream began human but descended rapidly into something else, a sound composed of too many frequencies for human vocal cords to produce. Her skin rippled like water, and beneath it something moved, restructuring bone and muscle according to geometries that violated every natural law. The transformation took perhaps 90 seconds. When it was complete, the thing that had been Helena rose to its feet, the chains falling away from limbs that bent in too many directions. Its face still bore a resemblance to the woman Catalina had known, but twisted into an expression of ecstasy so intense it had become indistinguishable from agony. It opened its mouth and laughed, and the sound was like wind through a graveyard at midnight. The cultists moved forward to embrace their new sibling, welcoming it into the fold with words of praise and encouragement. They stroked its altered flesh with reverence, admiring the changes wrought by their master's power. Catalina watched in paralysed horror as the process repeated itself around the circle. Each captive underwent their own unique metamorphosis, their bodies and minds reshaped by forces that existed beyond human comprehension. Some grew in size, their muscles swelling to grotesque proportions as bone spurs erupted through their skin. Others seemed to collapse inward, their forms becoming lean and predatory, their fingers elongating into claws designed for rending flesh. A few developed additional limbs or sensory organs in places where no such things should exist. The young man who had wept earlier transformed last, his body convulsing as his spine extended and split, creating multiple serpentine appendages that writhed independently. His skull elongated and his jaw unhinged with audible pops, revealing rows of teeth that no evolutionary process could have produced. When he finally stood, he moved with a grace that was somehow more disturbing than the gross mutations of the others. And through it all, the chanting continued, rising in volume and intensity until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the ship. Catalina's turn approached with the inevitability of dawn. She could feel it now, the presence that the cultists had summoned. It pressed against the boundaries of reality like a child's face pressed against glass, eager and hungry and utterly alien. It wanted in. It wanted to touch her, to remake her, to claim her soul as its own. The leader stood before her now, his massive form blocking out the sickly light from the braziers. He reached down with one hand and lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze through the eye holes of his mask. What she saw there was not human hatred or human cruelty. It was something worse than either, something that viewed her with the same casual interest that she might have shown toward an insect. He spoke again, and this time the words were in Gothic, accented with sounds that made her teeth ache. "You have been chosen for a great honour, little one. Your flesh shall be a vessel for divine purpose. Your soul shall burn with the light of the true gods. You shall know pleasures and pains beyond mortal comprehension. You shall be remade in the image of perfection eternal." Catalina found her voice at last, though what emerged was barely more than a whisper. Please, I don't want this. I just want to go home. I have a daughter. She needs me. Please." The leader tilted his head, considering her words with what might have been genuine curiosity. Then he laughed, and the sound was like bells tolling in a dead city. "Home? There is no home for you now, child. There is only the embrace of the gods. Your daughter will forget you soon enough. She will grow and live and die and be forgotten in turn, just another grain of sand in the infinite desert of existence. But you shall transcend such meaningless cycles. You shall become eternal." He raised the book above her head and began to read once more. The words felt like acid poured directly into her brain, burning away everything she had been, everything she had hoped to be. Memories of her daughter's face, of her husband's voice, of quiet moments in their small hab unit all began to blur and dissolve like watercolours in the rain. The heat intensified until Catalina was certain her blood would boil in her veins. The air crackled with energy that made her hair stand on end, and her skin prickle with static electricity. And then, with a sensation like falling through the floor, reality itself seemed to tear open. Something vast and terrible turned its attention toward her. Catalina felt it touch her mind, and in that instant she understood with perfect clarity what the cultists served. It was not a being in any conventional sense, but rather a concept made manifest, an idea given form and consciousness by the collective fears and hatreds and desperate prayers of countless trillions. It existed in a realm where thought and matter were one, where emotions shaped reality and desire could reshape the laws of physics themselves, and it was hungry. It flowed into her like water into a cracked vessel, filling every empty space, every doubt and fear and secret shame. It found the hidden places in her soul where she had locked away her true feelings, all the rage at a life spent in servitude, all the bitter resentment of a system that treated her as nothing more than a replaceable cog, all the dark fantasies of revenge and power that she had never dared speak aloud. The entity fed on these emotions, growing stronger with each negative thought it consumed. But it also offered something in return: power, freedom, the ability to reshape reality according to her will, to become something more than the insignificant worker drone she had always been. For a moment, Catalina stood at a crossroads. She could resist, could try to hold on to her humanity, her identity, everything that made her who she was. Or she could surrender, could let herself be swept away on a tide of dark ecstasy, could become something terrible and powerful and free. The choice seemed obvious in the moment. How could she choose suffering when pleasure was offered? How could she choose weakness when strength beckoned? How could she choose to remain a slave when godhood was within reach? She opened herself to the change, and the universe exploded into sensation. Pain and pleasure merged into a single, overwhelming experience that transcended human language. Her body became molten, every cell simultaneously dying and being reborn. She felt her bones lengthen and twist. Her organs rearranged themselves according to new and alien anatomies. Her skin split and reformed, growing scales in some places and smooth porcelain in others. But worse than the physical transformation was the mental one. The entity that had entered her mind did not simply coexist with her consciousness. It integrated itself into every thought, every memory, every definition of self. The woman who had been Catalina was not destroyed or replaced, but rather merged with something vast and ancient, creating a new hybrid consciousness that was neither wholly human nor wholly demon. She remembered her daughter, but now the memory carried different emotional weight. The love she had felt was still there, but transformed into something possessive and consuming. She wanted to claim her daughter, to bring her into this new existence, to share the terrible gift she had received. The maternal instinct remained, but was twisted into something darker, something that would devour rather than nurture. When the transformation was complete, the thing that rose from the circle bore only passing resemblance to the woman who had knelt there minutes before. It stood nearly 2 meters tall, its body a fusion of human and something else entirely. Its skin shimmered with iridescent scales that caught the light in hypnotic patterns. Its hands had become things of beauty and horror, fingers elongated into graceful claws capable of carving through steel as easily as flesh. But the eyes retained some spark of what had been Catalina. They looked out at the world with a mixture of rapture and infinite sadness, as if some small part of the original woman remained trapped behind them, screaming silently at what she had become. The leader of the cultists bowed low, offering reverence to the newly born creature. "Welcome, chosen one. Welcome to your true purpose. Your old life has ended, and your eternal service begins now." The creature that was no longer quite Catalina looked down at its transformed body and laughed. The sound was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, carrying notes of genuine joy mixed with the echoes of a soul in torment. It flexed its new hands, marveling at the power that coursed through altered muscles and restructured bones. Around the circle, the other transformed captives moved and swayed, their bodies responding to rhythms only they could perceive. They had become a congregation, a gathering of the faithful reborn in the image of their dark masters. They would serve now, would spread the infection of chaos to every corner of the galaxy they could reach. The ritual was complete. 19 souls had entered this cargo hold as human beings. 19 monsters emerged, each one a living testament to the terrible power of the ruinous powers. They would be deployed across the sector, sent to infiltrate Imperial worlds and corrupt them from within. They would whisper dark truths to the weak-willed and desperate. They would perform their own rituals, creating more of their kind. They would be missionaries of damnation, and they would never tire, never falter, never cease in their unholy work. This was the fate of those sacrificed to chaos. Not simple death, but transformation into something that existed in eternal torment and eternal ecstasy simultaneously. The gods of the warp did not simply consume their followers. They remade them, reshaped them, claimed them utterly and completely. And the most terrible part was that somewhere, buried deep within each transformed cultist, the original person still existed, aware and conscious and unable to stop the horror their body now enacted. Catalina was gone, but also she remained. She was the monster, and the monster was her. There was no separation, no clean division between what had been and what now was. They were one entity, a fusion of human suffering and demonic power, and that fusion would endure for as long as the dark gods willed it. The leader raised his arms and the congregation responded, their voices joining in a hymn of praise to powers that should never have been acknowledged. They sang of the glory of chaos, of the weakness of the false emperor, of the coming age when all of humanity would be similarly enlightened. Outside the cargo hold, the ship's crew continued their duties, unaware of what had transpired in the depths below. The captain plotted his course to their next destination, a mining colony on the fringes of the sector. The navigator peered into the warp, seeking safe passage through the immaterium. The engineer tended his beloved machines, offering prayers to the Omnissiah. None of them knew that the ship now carried corruption in its belly. None of them suspected that by the time they reached their destination, they would all be infected, all transformed, all claimed by the same dark powers that had remade the cargo hold's former captives. This was how chaos spread across the galaxy, not through open warfare, though that came in time, not through obvious corruption, though that too played its role, but through subtle infiltration, through the steady conversion of desperate souls one by one, through the patient work of transforming ordinary citizens into living weapons of spiritual warfare. The thing that remembered being Catalina looked at its transformed siblings and felt something like kinship. They were a family now, bound together by their shared damnation. They would fight together, die together, be reborn together in the eternal cycle of the warp. Their individual identities meant nothing anymore. They were simply extensions of the dark god's will, fingers on a vast hand that reached across the galaxy. And in her final moment of clarity before her human consciousness was completely subsumed into the Gestalt, Catalina thought of her daughter one last time. She hoped the girl would run, would hide, would somehow escape what was coming. She hoped that somewhere someone would save her from the fate that had claimed her mother, but hope was a lie. Hope had always been a lie. There was only the will of chaos, eternal and inevitable, and it was coming for them all. The execution chamber on Tertium Prime had not been used for its original purpose in 3 standard years, where once the Adeptus Arbits had administered swift imperial justice to heretics and traitors, something far more insidious now held court. The stone walls still bore scorch marks from promethium flamers, and the floor remained stained with the blood of countless criminals. But these remnants of righteous punishment had become props in a theatre of corruption far more subtle and deadly than anything the Imperium had ever imposed. Marcus Vollen had been a medici, trained in the great hospices of the upper hive to mend flesh and preserve life. He had dedicated 47 years to his craft, treating everything from minor injuries sustained in manufacturum accidents to the virulent diseases that periodically swept through the underhive. He had seen suffering in all its mundane forms, had witnessed death in its natural progression, had understood pain as a biological response to damage that could be treated with pharmacological precision. Nothing in his training had prepared him for the blessing of Grandfather Nurgle. The cultists who brought him to the chamber wore robes stained with substances that defied medical categorization. Their faces were hidden behind masks fashioned from the shells of enormous insects, and through the eye-holes Marcus could see not eyes but clusters of smaller insects, each one alive and crawling over the others. They moved with a shuffling gait, their bodies swaying in rhythm with some unheard music, and from them emanated an odour so overwhelming that Marcus's medici-trained mind tried and failed to identify all the components of decay it contained. They bound him to a stone altar that had been defaced with carvings of bloated figures dancing in gardens of fungal growth. The restraints were unnecessary. Marcus had no strength left to resist. The plague had been working through his system for 6 days now, ever since he had treated a patient presenting with what appeared to be a simple fever. The patient had smiled at him as Marcus administered medication, and in that smile Marcus had seen something terrible. Understanding. Welcome. Love. Within hours the first symptoms had appeared. Fever, yes, but also a strange euphoria that made his skin tingle with pleasure. Boils erupted across his chest and arms, each one bursting with fluid that smelled paradoxically sweet. His flesh began to sag and bloat, but instead of pain there was only a peculiar sensation of fullness, as if his body was becoming pregnant with something precious and new. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in imperial medical doctrine, screamed that this was wrong. He was dying, his organs were shutting down. The bacteria or viral agents or whatever impossible pathogens infected him were destroying his body at a cellular level. He should be in agony. He should be terrified. Instead, Marcus felt loved. The cultist leader approached the altar, and Marcus recognized him. Proctor Harlian, who administered the lower hive districts, who Marcus had met countless times at administrative functions, whose hand Marcus had shaken in ceremony when the proctor awarded him a commendation for exemplary service. Harlian's face was barely recognizable now, transformed into something that existed in the uncomfortable space between human and other. His skin had taken on a greenish pallor, and his features had softened and swollen until they possessed an almost childlike innocence, despite the corruption evident in every pore. When Harlian spoke, his voice bubbled with genuine warmth and affection that Marcus found horrifyingly sincere. "Brother Marcus, how wonderful that you've come to join our family. Grandfather has been watching you for so long, admiring your dedication to healing, your compassion for the suffering. He wants to give you his greatest gift. He wants to show you that suffering and joy are not opposites, but merely different aspects of the same beautiful cycle." Marcus tried to respond to denounce this heresy, to call upon the Emperor's protection, but his throat had swollen shut with infection. Only a wet gurgling emerged from his lips, and even that sound was accompanied by a spray of blood and pus that spattered across Harlian's robes. The proctor looked down at the new stains with the pride of a father whose child had just taken their first steps. "Yes, you're already beginning to bloom. Can you feel it, Marcus? Can you feel how the gift grows within you? Every infection, every bacterial colony, every virus and parasite, they're all children of Grandfather. They're family, and they love you so very much." Other cultists gathered around the altar, forming a circle. They began to chant in unison, words that sounded like coughing and retching transformed into liturgy. As they chanted, they removed concealed canisters from within their robes and began to spray the air with atomized fluids that hung in the chamber like fog. Marcus breathed it in. He had no choice. His lungs drew in the contaminated atmosphere, and immediately new infections bloomed within his respiratory tissue. But along with the disease came sensation beyond anything he had experienced in his decades of conscious existence. Each breath became an act of transcendence. The pain in his chest transformed into pressure that bordered on orgasmic release. His degrading neurons fired in patterns that produced colours he had never seen, sounds he had never heard, tastes he could never have imagined. Harlian leaned close, his breath carrying the scent of gangrene and honey in equal measure. "You spent your life fighting entropy, Marcus, fighting the natural processes of decay and regeneration. But Grandfather teaches us that decay is not an ending but a transformation. When your flesh rots, it feeds the bacteria. When the bacteria multiply, they feed the flies. When the flies lay their eggs, they feed the maggots. When the maggots mature, they feed the birds. Everything is connected. Everything feeds everything else. Death is just another way of giving life. And suffering is just the sensation of transformation." Marcus's vision had begun to fragment. What he saw with his eyes no longer matched what his deteriorating brain interpreted. The chamber's walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lung tissue. The cultists' bodies appeared to be made of living insects held together by force of will alone. And beyond them, in the spaces between reality, Marcus could see into somewhere else entirely. A garden stretched into impossible distances, its landscape composed of fungal growths the size of mountains and willow trees whose branches wept diseased nectar into rivers of bubbling decay. The sky was not sky, but flesh. And clouds were not vapour, but swarms of flies so dense they blocked out whatever passed for sun in this place. And moving through the garden were figures, billions upon billions of figures, each one bloated and rotting and joyful beyond measure. They were dancing. They danced alone and in groups, spinning and swaying to music that came from everywhere and nowhere. They embraced each other, and where their putrid flesh touched, new diseases were born and shared like gifts at a festival. They sang praises to their creator, and their voices were beautiful in a way that transcended aesthetic judgment. Beautiful the way a mathematical proof is beautiful, beautiful in its perfect rightness. And at the centre of it all sat Grandfather himself. Marcus could not look at him directly. The entity was too vast, too conceptually complex for human perception. But in glimpses, between the gaps in his failing vision, Marcus saw enough. Saw a being whose body contained all disease, all decay, all entropy made manifest and living. Saw love so absolute and unconditional that it rendered the Imperium's cold doctrine of sacrifice and duty into petty cruelty by comparison. Nurgle loved his children. He loved them with every infection, every painful transformation, every moment of suffering that brought them closer to understanding the beautiful truth of existence. Pain was just sensation, and sensation meant life, and life was the greatest gift of all. Marcus wept, whether from gratitude or horror even he could not say. The chanting intensified. The cultists swayed faster, their movements becoming frenetic. Several collapsed, their bodies overcome by diseases that had been dormant within them, finally blooming in response to the ritual's psychic resonance. But they fell laughing, their faces split by grins that revealed teeth turned to crumbling chalk, and from their mouths poured clouds of spores that drifted through the chamber seeking new hosts. Marcus felt his body begin to rupture. The infections within him had reached critical mass, and his flesh could no longer contain them. Boils burst across his torso, each one releasing not merely pus but tiny demon things, miniature manifestations of Nurgle's power no larger than insects. They crawled across his skin, burrowing back into new wounds, creating an ecosystem of micro-corruption that existed in a symbiotic loop with his degrading tissues. His abdomen distended, swelling to 3 times its normal size. He could feel movement within, countless small forms gestation in the cavity where his organs used to function. When his belly finally split open, what emerged was not his intestines, but a mass of squirming Nurglings, each one perfect in its grotesque simplicity, each one giggling with innocent malice. They scattered across the altar and onto the floor, spreading throughout the chamber with the enthusiasm of newborns exploring their world for the first time. The cultists welcomed them with cries of delight, scooping them up and cradling them like infants, cooing nonsense words of affection as the tiny demons bit into their flesh with needle teeth. Marcus should have been dead. By any rational medical standard, the trauma alone should have killed him instantly. But Nurgle's gifts did not follow rational medical standards. The infection sustained him, animated him, kept his consciousness burning, even as his body transformed into something that bore only passing resemblance to the human form it had once possessed. He sat up on the altar, his movements jerky and uncoordinated as new muscle structures formed to replace those lost to necrosis. His skin had turned a mottled green-brown, and from every pore oozed fluids that immediately attracted swarms of flies. His face had collapsed inward, his features melting like wax, but his eyes remained, now replaced by compound structures that saw the world in facets of decay and regeneration. When he tried to speak, what emerged was not words but a sound like wind through a charnel house, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The cultists understood him perfectly. "Welcome home, brother," Harlian said, embracing Marcus despite the corruption that poured from every surface of his transformed body. "Welcome to the family. Welcome to joy without end." Marcus returned the embrace, and as their diseased flesh pressed together, he felt the garden of Nurgle open fully within his mind. He was there now, truly there, even as his physical form remained in the execution chamber. He existed simultaneously in the material universe, and in the realm beyond, his consciousness expanded to encompass both states of being. This was not death. This was transcendence of a sort the Imperial Creed had never offered. The Emperor promised suffering and sacrifice in exchange for an abstract salvation that might come at some undefined point in the future. Nurgle offered immediate and absolute acceptance, a place in an eternal family where every member was cherished despite their flaws or perhaps because of them. In the garden, Marcus danced. His grotesque new form moved with grace impossible for his original body, spinning among billions of other blessed souls, each one unique in their corruption, each one loved beyond measure by their grandfather. There was no judgment here, no hierarchy of worthiness, no need to prove devotion through suffering. Suffering simply existed as another form of sensation, neither good nor bad, just another aspect of the infinite experience of being. The rational part of Marcus, the part that still remembered his medical training, tried one final time to assert itself. This was madness. This was corruption. This was heresy of the highest order. He had betrayed everything the Imperium stood for, betrayed humanity itself by accepting the gifts of an enemy that sought only to degrade and destroy. But even as these thoughts formed, they dissolved like sugar in acid. Grandfather's love washed over them, through them, transforming even his doubts into gratitude. Yes, he had betrayed the Imperium, but the Imperium had made him suffer for decades under the weight of impossible expectations and cruel indifference. Yes, he had accepted corruption, but corruption was only transformation, and transformation was growth, and growth was life itself. The garden welcomed all who came to it, turned away none who sought comfort in decay's embrace. And Marcus, for the first time in his long life, felt truly home. Around him, the other cultists continued their celebration. They would leave this chamber soon and return to their positions throughout the hive, spreading grandfather's gifts wherever they went. A touch here, a sneeze there, contaminated water supplies and spoiled food, each vector of infection carefully cultivated to maximize propagation, while minimizing immediate detection. The Imperium would send its agents eventually. The Inquisition would come with flamers and sanctioned psychers, would burn and purge and declare the hive cleansed. But seeds had already been planted in 1,000 other locations, spores carried on trade ships to distant worlds, infections dormant in the bodies of Imperial servants who did not yet know they served a kinder master. The plague would spread. It always did. And with it would spread relief from the cruel lies of the false emperor, from the endless grinding misery of existence in a galaxy that offered nothing but suffering and meaningless sacrifice. Nurgle's way was suffering too, but suffering transformed into purpose, suffering made beautiful by acceptance and understanding. Marcus looked at his new hands, watched maggots writhe beneath translucent skin, felt the pleasant burning of infections coursing through veins that pumped ichor instead of blood. He was beautiful now in his own way. Grandfather had made him beautiful. The transformation complete, the cultists led him from the chamber. There was work to do. So many souls still trapped in the cold embrace of the corpse god's empire. So many desperate people crying out for relief they didn't know existed. Marcus would bring them that relief. He would show them grandfather's love, one infection at a time. As he walked through the Underhive's perpetually dim corridors, citizens scattered before him, their faces twisted in horror and disgust. They saw a monster, a plague-bearer, an abomination that violated every natural law. They could not see what he saw, could not feel what he felt, could not understand that every drop of his fluids that splashed on the ground was a gift waiting to be accepted. But they would understand eventually. When the boils appeared on their skin, when the fever took hold and the hallucinations began, when grandfather's love finally reached them and they saw the garden for the first time, then they would understand. Then they would thank him for this blessing. Marcus had been sacrificed to chaos, but the sacrifice had not been made by cultists or dark rituals. The real sacrifice had been made by the Imperium itself, which had created the conditions of such desperate suffering that Nurgle's promises seemed like paradise by comparison. The real heresy was not the worship of the Plague Lord, but the empire that made such worship appealing. In the garden, grandfather laughed, not with cruelty, but with genuine joy at his newest child's first steps into enlightenment. Another soul claimed, another servant gained, another vector of glorious infection spreading his gifts throughout the uncaring galaxy. And in execution chambers and hospices and underhive tenements, across 1,000,000 worlds, the same process repeated itself. The desperate, the suffering, the forgotten and the abandoned all reached out for something, anything that might ease their pain. And sometimes, when conditions were right, Grandfather reached back. This was what it meant to be sacrificed to chaos. Not a dramatic moment of terror and death, but a gradual seduction, a slow dissolution of self into something larger and more terrible and more loving than the human soul was ever meant to contain. It was transformation, corruption, damnation, and salvation, all merged into one incomprehensible whole. Marcus walked the Underhive paths, spreading joy wherever his footsteps fell. Behind him, the first of his gifts took root in the desperate soil of imperial misery. Before him, 1,000,000 more souls awaited enlightenment. And above him, in the warp, Grandfather watched with 1,000,000,000 eyes and smiled with 1,000,000,000 mouths and loved with a love so absolute it could only be expressed through perfect decay. The wheel turned, the cycle continued, and in the garden, the dancing never stopped. Elsewhere, on a world whose name had been erased from imperial records, a different ritual reached its apex. Where Nurgle offered diseased transcendence and unending joy through decay, the Prince of Pleasure demanded something far more refined, far more personal, far more devastating to the soul that experienced it. The Pleasure House had once catered to the highest echelons of the planetary government. Its corridors were decorated with artwork that pushed the boundaries of acceptability, its chambers equipped with technologies designed to stimulate every human sense to the edge of tolerance. The wealthy came here to indulge in experiences they could not admit to wanting, to explore desires that polite society forbade, to shed the restrictive manners of their stations and embrace appetites that defined them more truly than any title or rank. The house's proprietor, a woman who called herself Madame Valeria, had always known the dangers of dancing so close to that edge, but she had been careful, had maintained rigid boundaries, had ensured that every indulgence remained firmly within the realm of human experience, however extreme. Then the whispers began. They came first in dreams, promises of sensations beyond anything her establishment could provide. They spoke of pleasures that transcended the merely physical, of experiences that would make every prior indulgence seem like colourless shadows compared to true illumination. They offered perfection. Valeria, who had spent 40 years pursuing the perfect experience, the ultimate sensation, the pinnacle of aesthetic achievement, found herself unable to resist. She gathered her most trusted staff, those who shared her vision of pushing human experience to its absolute limits, and together they performed the ritual the whispers described. The changes were subtle at first. The pleasure house's atmosphere shifted in ways that existing clients could not quite articulate. The art on the walls seemed more vibrant, more alive, as if the painted figures might step from their frames at any moment. The music that drifted through the corridors carried harmonics that normal instruments could not produce. The wines tasted somehow more wine-like, the foods more flavourful, every sensory input amplified beyond its previous intensity. The clients loved it. They came more frequently, stayed longer, spent more lavishly. Some never left at all, losing themselves so completely in the enhanced sensations that their bodies simply forgot to maintain the baseline functions necessary for survival. They died with smiles on their faces, their final moments filled with such overwhelming pleasure that their hearts simply could not contain it. Valeria knew she should have been horrified. Death was bad for business after all. But the dead client's expressions haunted her, not with terror, but with envy. They had achieved what she had spent her entire life pursuing. They had found the perfect experience, the ultimate sensation. And then they had died, unable to continue beyond that singular perfect moment. She would not make that mistake. The entity that answered her renewed prayers did not announce itself with grandeur or terrible majesty. It came as a whisper, as a suggestion, as a subtle reconfiguration of desire itself. It showed her that death was only a limitation for those who remained fully human, that transcendence required sacrifice not of others, but of the very concept of limitation itself. The Dark Prince offered her everything she had ever wanted in exchange for everything she had ever been. She accepted. The transformation that overtook Valeria was nothing like the grotesque metamorphosis of Nurgle's Blessed or the rage-fueled mutation of Khorne's champions. Her body became more beautiful, more perfect, more aesthetically flawless with each passing hour. Her skin took on an iridescent quality that caught light in impossible ways. Her features refined themselves to a symmetry that human genetics could never naturally achieve. Her voice became music itself, every word a carefully orchestrated symphony of meaning and emotion. But beneath the beauty lay something far more terrible than any physical corruption. Her soul, her essential self, became hollowed out and replaced with an endless hunger that could never be satisfied. Every sensation she experienced, no matter how intense, became immediately insufficient, immediately ordinary, immediately boring. She required more, always more, newer experiences, stranger indulgences, pleasures that pushed further into the territory of pain and horror, because only at those extremes could she still feel anything at all. Her staff underwent similar transformations, each according to their own deepest desires. Some became impossibly graceful, their movements a constant dance of seduction. Others developed the ability to alter their forms at will, becoming whatever their clients most desired. A few transformed into living artworks, their bodies covered in patterns that shifted and changed according to the viewer's preferences. And all of them, every single one, became addicted to sensation in a way that made mortal addiction seem like mild preference. The pleasure house attracted new clientele. Word spread among certain circles. Whispered recommendations passed between those who sought experiences beyond the mundane. They came expecting enhanced pleasure and received transformation instead. Some resisted, fled screaming from chambers that promised perfection but delivered damnation. Others surrendered immediately, recognizing in Slanesh's gifts the answer to questions they had not known they were asking. This was the seduction of chaos in its purest form, not force, not obvious corruption, but the gentle escalation of existing desires until those desires consumed everything else. The Prince of Pleasure understood that mortals already wanted most of what chaos offered. They wanted power, wanted pleasure, wanted to transcend the boundaries that limited their experiences. Slanesh simply removed those boundaries and showed them what lay beyond. And what lay beyond was madness dressed in silk and speaking in poetry, beautiful and terrible and utterly, completely, irredeemably damning.